program relates the news of the week
Funny.
to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains
Whenever you
by
want to hit it,
force
just hit it
its
there.
control
For
of the
the other one.
legislative,
Okay, good.
executive, and judicial processes in America. And now, Mae Brussell.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Dialogue Conspiracy number 249, December 27th, 1976. This is the last week of this year of 1976, the end of the American bicentennial. It's also the last week on Dolores Street in Carmel for KLRB. The studio is now moving to another building about a mile away. Carmel by the sea will move away from its pretty view with the front window of the ocean, and we're going to another location, a new barn building above the Thunderbird bookstore in Carmel. The regular studio that I've used for 5.5 years is emptied out. The control machines, everything is gone, and it's kind of a sad day. I've been here 5.5 years at KLRB, and I have a lot of fond memories of being at this studio. And we're not only changing the location of KLRB, but the owners are going to change soon, and the station has been sold to new owners. And I would like to make a few comments on the ownership and the management of this station before we get into a summary of some of the news events of the past year and maybe a few predictions of the future. KLRB started on the air in December 1970, and at that time the country was in a turmoil. Richard Nixon was president. That's the man that nobody would have bought a used car from for years. Nobody trusted or supposedly didn't, and all of a sudden he's elected president. Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and we were in a state of emergency with riots at Isla Vista down in Santa Barbara at the time, at the university. I started with a discussion of the Pentagon Papers it was June 1971, with Gloria Barron. She and Bob Barron helped start this station as station manager, and we had a program, the two of us, called Dialogue Conspiracy, and we talked about the news that day and about the break of the Pentagon Papers. And after that week, I came back the next week and did a news analysis with Gloria, and we did it together until she moved down to Los Angeles. She's at KMPC, has been down there the last couple of years, and other people replaced her and Bob at the station. I think the fact that I was able to be on the air here for 5.5 years, and hopefully the new owners will allow me to be on. I haven't met them, so this is the iffy thing. I don't know what is going to happen with the management in a short time when they take over. But this is a military town. A lot of people don't realize it, many people do. We have the famous, notorious spy school, the language school, and the Hunter Liggett. The laser beam experiments are done down there, the weapons, it's in Monterey County. And the Navy Postgraduate School in Fort Ord, and we're close to the Kashawa satellites and the Monterey Institute for Foreign Studies, and close to the Soledad prison, where they've been able to receive these programs with FM stations if they have them. And I've reached a lot of people, and as I say, there's retired military and there's current military, but I think it's to the credit of the military institutions around here, or the powers that be, and there are a lot of powers that be. There are a lot of very famous, wealthy people like Ronald Reagan that would fly into Pebble Beach for various briefings, and our ambassador to Italy, Mr. Firestone, lives at Pebble Beach. There's a lot of power in this city. There's a lot of political clout. There's a lot of military power. And there's a lot of wealth. And as far as I know, KLRB was not pressured by any of these people to stop the program. If anybody suggested it, it was never mentioned to me, with the exception of one car agency that I heard didn't want advertising while I was on the air. And they eventually took it, advertising in the station, and I continued, and there was never a conflict in terms of what the station managers wanted to do. So that with all the power and the wealth and the military here, and being able to talk during the years of the anti-war protest and on the air in 71, 72, and through the Watergate crisis, and on through all the current conspiracies, and trying to expose the past conspiracies, and even talking about our Attorney General, Emil Younger. He once wrote to this station about something that I had said on the air. There was never pressure of those people who could tell what I was saying, and the people at KLRB gave me maximum opportunity to share my research. That doesn't mean they agreed with everything I said, but they gave me the support to say what I wanted to say or what I thought was happening, and they had confidence in my research. There was no toning down the names that I used on the air. There was no criticizing for what are so-called wild allegations, and much to their credit, the news caught up with these events, and the things that I had been saying were coming true, and you see more and more in the news, things that we've said on Dialogue Conspiracy, chemical poisoning, simulated warfare in San Francisco, those kind of things that I've talked about, the bacteriological warfare, even using earthquakes as a warfare weapon, many things coming in the news now, and many names of people being indicted or charged with crimes, and even people like the President of the United States and the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, and now there are new investigations into the CIA. I was given total confidence to do this. And the station at the time was new, and in 1970, business wasn't that good in Carmel. There was kind of a slump, and there was a big investment of a young person here, Ed Johnson, who invested in this station, and yet he let these disc jockeys come in, these hippies, who didn't have that much training, even with radio work, but they knew music, and they knew what the musical scene was, and they carried the news well. And they began in Carmel the first alternative news service on the Monterey Peninsula that goes up to Santa Cruz. There are some stations up there, but nothing like that here. We have several other stations, but they all play it very straight. So this station has allowed the Zodiac News Service and the Earth News and the alternative news services to be heard, and it's the only station that gives you a 180-degree difference between what the straight stations are saying, and they presented different sounds, and there was no curtailing what was to be played, and the young people were allowed to select what they thought was appropriate for the times, and the result was that the station was able to get all the advertising it needed for an FM station, and it was sold, I understand, at a good price. And so the lesson here, I think there's a lot of lessons in what's happened at KLRB in terms of my own programming and the station here, and through this whole hippie movement and presenting other stories in the news that was done, was that other stations around the country could have done what KLRB did. They bowed down to the powers that be, such as WBAI in New York, or the Pacifica stations up in LA, down LA, KPFA and KPFK up in Berkeley. A lot of FM stations acted very interested in liberal causes of the anti-war movement and so forth, but they really bowed to the pressure and did curtail the news and the amount of things that could be said over the air. And I know many of the radio stations through my work at KLRB, and for that I'm grateful, because I was able to reach people all over the country, and particularly Sacramento and Ohio and San Diego and New York, and there's certain cities around the country where this program was played regularly and got entrenched, and I met people through it and lectured at these places, and met many, many people through this research. And the opportunity started here at KLRB, and it started in this building. They'll be moving next week, as I say, this week. They're half packed up now. And then when the new owners come in, we'll wait and see. If I'm not allowed on the air, if they stop the program, you can always write letters if you miss Dialogue Conspiracy and let them know how you feel. Nicholas Johnson, who's head of Federal Communications, was on KGO a few weeks ago, and he was saying that when stations are sold, they're not allowed to change the format. If they've had a regular format for any given length of time, they're not allowed to cancel it out. So as I haven't met the new people coming in, and I don't know who they are, I only know that one of the persons to manage it lives in the Santa Cruz area, and the other one is from Tucson, Arizona. Of course, you can afford to be a little paranoid in this game when you begin to expose some of these conspiracies, particularly the Howard Hughes hoax. And I saw an article in the Las Vegas Sun, Sunday, December the 12th, and it had to do with some memos about Hank Greenspun, who's the publisher of the Las Vegas Sun. And some of these memos that are in the position, they're owned now by Johnny Meyer, who used to work for Howard Hughes. He lives in Vancouver. Some of these memos indicated the Hughes empire was going to buy the Las Vegas Sun away from Hank Greenspun, and they put up a price. There was a memo August 5th, 1974, to move immediately and buy the whole Don Ray's Review-Journal and sell it for 5 cents a copy, get it out cheap, and buy up the radio stations, entire news media and radio stations in California and Nevada, as well as including the Review-Journal. Now, I don't know which radio stations in California this Hughes memo referred to, At this point, the memo allegedly went out in 75. I had been on the air talking for a year on the fact that Howard Hughes had been buried by Onassis in 1972. And I've been trying to point out the Howard Hughes hoax at lectures that I go to colleges and various places on the radio. This memo of Johnny Myers that he has of Howard Hughes said to go after Hank Greenspun, the editor of the Las Vegas Sun, hire a group of lawyers who know how to fight dirty, attach everything that Robert Mayo and Greenspun have, hire the 3 of the best detective agencies, and find out what is happening and who is after him in Washington. And then the memo went on, put 90 detectives on Greenspun's tail alone, follow him 24 hours a day, and buy up the newspaper, the group that controls his newspaper. So the Hughes people were really on their toes, and I don't know, coming from Tucson, Arizona, as I say, I don't know who bought the place, but the Hughes people do buy up radio stations, they do buy up newspapers. So until we know what the future brings, I guess I can afford to have a healthy paranoia and wonder, what the future holds. And whatever it is, we accept it or we fight it, one of two, we'll see what happens later. I feel, every time a new year comes in, you come in with a lot of enthusiasm and resolutions, or you should have them. But I think after 13 years research, I feel a little bit sad as this 1977 comes in. I feel sad because I take so many newspapers and have so many books on the various assassinations and conspiracies, and I know that the people in office do not want to use this research. These people have written books and exposed corruption or exposed illegal acts of the CIA and the FBI, and various assassinations and conspiracies, and yet the transition team, say, of Jimmy Carter or Carter himself, gives no inkling at all that anything is going to change to stop this massive corruption. Attorney General Levy was on Meet the Press yesterday, and they said, how come Richard Helms hasn't been charged with perjury before the congressional committees? He was the head of the FBI and perjured himself under oath. And Levy says, well, the Justice Department is looking into that. And they say, well, how come FBI men that clearly did illegal acts or burglarizing weren't charged with a burglary? And he says, well, we're looking into that. Or they say one gentleman resigned from the FBI. How come the others who are doing current burglaries haven't resigned? And Attorney General Levy says, well, that's to the credit of Mr. Kelly, Clarence Kelly of the FBI, the director, that he doesn't expose these things before they go to court. So either way, if a man stays on the job and he's a criminal, his boss is praised for keeping the way clear for the courts. And yet, when they resign, like Congressman Hayes resigned, he wasn't punished for anything the Ethics Committee didn't go into. His putting women on the salary, 2 to 3 women actually it was, and for his various sex orgies, or Congressman Leggett having 2 wives and 2 sets of children, and he was reelected in the last election. These things don't go before the Ethics Committee, and nobody seems to want to be doing anything about them. And Jimmy Carter just made Mr. Ted Sorensen the head of the FBI. He comes from the wealthy, prestigious law firm in Washington, D.C. and New York City that represents such clients as Jacqueline Kennedy and Spiro Agnew and many, many people of the counterintelligence group. Ted Sorensen belonged to that law firm, and he was one of the people that was behind the Bay of Pigs operation when John Kennedy was in office. He worked with John Kennedy. He encouraged Robert Kennedy to run for office, and Robert Kennedy was slain. And Ted Sorensen has never helped one researcher, never wanted to know who killed his boss. These have been the ostriches of America. And this kind of man is placed as head of the CIA, and we know that there'll be no encouragement from him to prosecute people involved in the killing of John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King, because Ted Sorensen and Pierre Salinger and Larry O'Brien and Frank Mankiewicz, all of Kennedy's so-called liberal cohorts, betrayed him in a way that it would be identical to having the 12 people at the Last Supper squeal or investigate who put Jesus up on the cross. The Kennedy assassination is symbolic of the way a leader is slain and then his friends turn their back and don't care and put down the various researchers and line up with the various associated and related assassins and then get top jobs. it's the year of top job and promotions for incompetence or for looking the other way, and that also is a depressing factor. I think of people like Mr. Charles Gaines from the San Francisco Police Department, who was in Oakland at the time of the Panthers shootout, that created Bobby Seale and George Jackson and Huey Newton, and there was so much killing and black people killed in that area. And Chief of Police Gaines was so inept and bad that he left the violence in Oakland, and then he went away to Canada for a year and down to Florida, I believe it was, and returned to become chief of the San Francisco Police Department. Now, the man was known for counterintelligence. He was known for the time of the violence and the creation of the anti-black feeling in Oakland. It was his department that claimed the San Quentin Six defendants in a case shot down a police helicopter. 2 policemen died, which had nothing at all to do with the San Quentin Six case except to prejudice possible jurors at the time. And along comes this Charles Gaines, who moves into the police department in San Francisco where other people should have had the job. He's not liked by the other policemen. He was appointed by Mayor Moscone, whose name has been linked to Howard Hughes money and funding. And so incompetence in Oakland pays off, and Gaines moved to San Francisco, where all of a sudden you get rashes of killings, 2 or 3 a day, of senseless violence, which is similar to the harassment of blacks in the Oakland area. And as I say, the secret team holds on tight. They don't give up, and incompetence paid off. Another example of incompetence paying off was Raymond Pecunier, who was head of the Department of Corrections in California. And he was in charge of beginning the segregation of the prisoners, the black, the Chicanos, and the white racist, white Aryan Brotherhood. And there were set up killings, the guards killing 3 blacks out in the courtyard in Soledad, and the knifings turning like the Roman gladiators, the white Aryan Brotherhood against the Black Panthers and Chicanos. And this violence got out of hand in the prison system, the segregation. And through the years, 71, we saw the Marin County shootout, the court shootout, where Judge Haley was killed, and Jonathan Jackson, that was George Jackson's brother. And then the violence at San Quentin Prison. And there was a lawsuit that was placed this year against the Los Angeles Police Department, and it was against the planning of criminal conspiracy section of a provocateur type shootout in the San Quentin prison that caused the arrest of the famous San Quentin Six. And Raymond Pecunier, who was very much part of all this violence in California, wasn't fired by Governor Brown. Again, this so-called liberal pose Brown takes on, which I think is a big phony pose, and I don't trust him at all on many, many things that he does. He didn't fire Raymond Pecunier, and many people want him fired. Some thought he was too far to the right, some too far to the left, but very few wanted him, and Brown kept him on. It made him in charge of the Department of the Mental Health. And then what happens? There we find that there's lawsuits pending, expensive lawsuits. There were murders in the mental hospitals in California, notorious drugging of patients, hanging of patients, murders, choking, and many, many deaths, 1,000 mysterious deaths that they think are murders. They believe are murders. 30 or 40 of them are being investigated, and a new lawsuit was just filed today by a man and his children. His wife was given a fatal drug. She was sent up to Camarillo, given a fatal drug without any tests or reason, and we have doctors prescribing on the telephone these fatal drugs. Well, Raymond Pecunier bungled things in the prison and brought so much heartache and pain and lawsuits and deaths and isolation holds, and then he moves on to the mental health department. So wouldn't you wonder that the duplication of bungling wouldn't take place? And it did, and we find a mess in the California mental hospitals. Another case of bungling and promotion are Chief of Police Ed Davis in Los Angeles and Attorney General Evelyn Younger. As I say, there's a lawsuit of families and guards for the killing in prison in August 1971 of prison guards based on the Louis Tackwood allegations that the criminal conspiracy section in Los Angeles had foreknowledge of these shootouts and supplied one of the guns that was supposed to belong to George Jackson, which George actually couldn't supply himself. It didn't fit into the tape cassette that was brought to him the day of the shootout. Couldn't fit in his wig, and it's hard for a person who's been solitary confinement for 7 years to come up with a gun. But now Ed Davis is talking about running for governor of California, and he's been promoted. He has the job of president of the International Police, and yet he never has to account for the allegations of Louis Tackwood of the Squad 19, the real breaking of the Watergate story in 1971, and he never has to explain the role of Donald DeFreeze with the criminal conspiracy section of Los Angeles Police Department, or the counterintelligence agents up in California at the time Judge Haley was killed, or the shootout in Marin County. All of that goes by the board, and the only thing that matters is that Ed Davis or Evel Younger want further promotions, and they're getting them, and they hope still to run for elective office and have some notoriety in California or claim for their jobs. There has been promotions, and there will be, and that is very depressing for me doing my work. I received a letter from a gentleman up in Folsom Prison, a postcard, which pretty well summarizes the conclusions that I've had after 13 years of work as I went through many newspapers and books and magazine articles. I think the hardest thing to come up with is not only did the Warren Commission and the news media lie about the killing of John Kennedy, but they lie about most major news events that we see. The news is so manipulated and controlled, really controlled, that hardly any news is coming out to people that they should be getting on a mass scale. And I received a card from a gentleman who's serving time at Folsom Prison. He charged one of the mass murders. We had a series of mass murders in Santa Cruz area where hippies and young women and a family were killed. And one of the gentlemen, I don't know if he'd want me to mention his name on the air, but he's one of the three that's charged with the mass murders. And I felt that all three of those were provocateur type setups where the men were under the control and influence of other persons, and they are patsies in the same way that Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy at the time of the John Kennedy assassination. And one of those persons who's serving his life sentence up at Folsom Prison wrote me as a postcard, and this is what he said: "The various big brothers have things pretty well controlled, but don't let your ego and imagination compound or confuse the real politic, because history is not much more than a justification of the ones who dominated at the time the ink hits the paper. The other points are seldom heard by the herd." H-E-A-R-D, by the H-E-R-D. This is a section of a postcard written by one of the patsies of a massacre, mass killing in Santa Cruz, who wrote to me, and I'll repeat again: "The various big brothers have things pretty well controlled, but don't let your ego and imagination compound or confuse the real politic, because history is not much more than a justification of the ones who dominated at the time the ink hits the paper, and the other points are seldom heard by the herd." That's why we have Dialogue Conspiracy, so that some of these other points, at least once a week or 45 minutes a week, plus the alternative news service, will be heard, maybe not by the herd, maybe by a handful, but we are reaching quite a few people, and that is better than not being able to share some of this information. I did get a Christmas card from Marguerite Oswald. That's another woman who has to bear the brunt of history saying that her son killed John Kennedy. She said on the card, "Remember always the charges against my late son are false. Sincerely, Marguerite Oswald." I was glad to hear from her, and of course I will always remember, and I hope you will too, as these various hoaxes get exposed. Now, the hoaxes, the giant hoaxes that I was mentioning, a few of them last week, the Howard Hughes hoax, the Amelia Earhart hoax, the Lindbergh kidnapping, the John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, the Pueblo affair, the U2 affair, almost all of the stories making the news are distorted for some reason, and every time you research them or study them, they go back to the core or the central core of those few people that are in power who are manipulating our news. There's a story I have here which should make the headlines all over, and this is an example of cutting news off if it isn't lied about, if the people who write it don't write it wrong, like saying how these murders were accomplished or who did them. There's another way of strangling news, and that's cutting it off. And I think that I see that in my work more and more. And it's another reason I'm really discouraged about 1977 is that as I read these 10 papers a day and get clippings from 5 more and from other cities around the country, I feel that my news is singularly told that it is not reaching other cities. And that is a very bad sign because so many people are cut off from events and can't respond to them, and even members of Congress aren't informed. If you write to them, they don't know half of what you're saying. Just an example of a news article that's in the Las Vegas Sun, dated December the 15th, and it should have made the Associated Press, United Press, and Reuters. And it should be a very important news article, and I'm going to read it to you because it only is in the Las Vegas Sun. And I only started taking that paper recently. I wish I had taken it all the years through the Watergate. But this is called Underworld Agent Sues the Summa Corporation. And it's written by Sharon Spiegelmeier. And the gist of this article is that a man who worked for the Underworld Ties, worked for Howard Hughes Corporation, was asked to get members of the CIA to invest in Las Vegas investments and get the mafia to invest and channel money through the CIA into the Hughes Vegas holdings. And he claims they didn't pay him enough for his fees and that they used these banks in Switzerland and the Bahamas, and that he was getting money for the Hughes hotels there. But the USUMA people, that's Hughes organization, didn't give him enough money for the investments he was getting, and so he's suing them. But in the course of the lawsuit, it tells you a lot about organized crime, the Vegas operation of Howard Hughes, and also the CIA. This article says, a man who was serving time in the federal prison filed a suit in U.S. court Monday claiming the Howard Hughes Summa Corporation broke a contract because they had him use his underworld ties to get investors for the Las Vegas Hughes hotels. Abe Rosenberg, who claims he's back in the federal prison on a car charge, wants $410,000 for a breach of trust from the Summa Corporation, from Howard Hughes, from Arlo Cederberg, Chester Davis, the New York lawyer, and Greg Bautzer. Rosenberg went into a contract on January the 5th, 1966. That was just a year ago, in a meeting with aides from the former Hughes Tool Company and associates of the Las Vegas Hotel to locate people to invest in the hotel and motels backed by the late Howard Hughes. According to the suit, Rosenberg met with many United States senators, he met with congressmen, he met with top government officials to get them to invest their money into hotels in Las Vegas. And this is a combination of congressmen, public officials, government intelligence, and the underworld. And the Summa Corporation, the attorney Chester Davis, he names as wanting these people to merge with the mafia and invest in these hotels in Vegas just a year ago. He claimed he met with government officials who turned out to be from the Central Intelligence Agency, as well as members of the noted La Costa Country Club in La Jolla, California. This is where most of the alleged underworld have invested their money. And he met with many wealthy persons with memberships at La Costa. Supposedly, Rosenberg was to be paid a finder's fee for getting investors into the Las Vegas operation. He was to get $40,000 plus another $100,000 a year for expenses. In July 1969, he deposited money in a Freeport, Bahamas bank. Then he channeled it back to Vegas and to Los Angeles banks. The money would go through several different banks in Miami, Florida, and then to California and Nevada. In 1970, still working for the operation, he entered federal prison to begin a 3-year sentence for mail fraud and income tax violation. And even while in prison, he met people to invest their money into various corporations, combining the CIA and the mafia in what were Hughes holdings in Nevada. In 73, Rosenberg said he met with Hughes officials in Los Angeles. They gave him $55,000 for fees while he served time in prison, and they were paying him while he was in prison, and then he got out in 1972 out of prison. By 1973, he had flown to Freeport. He met with government officials who were in on other deals that had been put together by the Hughes Corporation. And then they set up accounts in Freeport and Swiss bank accounts. He further stated that a hotel in Freeport was used as a meeting place many times. Hundreds of thousands of dollars changed hands in Freeport, and the money was put in top secret bank accounts. You wonder why congressmen won't investigate Reverend Moon with the Korean money in this country and the hotels he's buying, or the people that have jumped out windows fatally out of the hotels that he bought in New York City, or why they won't investigate whether Howard Hughes was buried in Houston, Texas or not. If Hughes was dead, the people running these kinds of deals would be charged with murder and kidnapping. But the Summa Corporation, very cleverly in 1975, from 69 to 75, evidently had the CIA and government officials and congressmen investing their money into Las Vegas. And that goes back now into the big battle that's going to be decided in the next month or two. If the Summa Corporation claims that Howard Hughes' investment indicates that his residence was in Las Vegas, they're fighting for that because they want to maintain those investments in the hotels just as they were. And if his residence was in Houston, Texas, then Texas will get approximately $350 million in taxes, but it will also begin to break up some of the Summa Corporation holdings. But here is a story about a man whose fees were paid while he was in jail, who met in Florida, who had links to a Bahamian bank, Swiss bank accounts. He says hundreds of thousands of dollars changed hands and went into top secret accounts, and the purpose of all this money exchanging and being paid off was to get CIA officials, congressmen, and public officials and the organized crime to invest in investments in Vegas as late as 1975 and 76. He's seeking now $310,000 plus $100,000 to protect for failure to protect him and pay his legal fees that were agreed upon by defendant and plaintiff upon going into the contract with the Summa Corporation. Rosenberg claims he can prove without any doubt these government officials and the senators and the congressmen invested money in many hotels and land with Hughes and his corporations. Now, with the Korean money, Korean CIA paying off many congressmen to the tunes of $1 million a year, I think it is, for the last few years, and the list of all the congressmen is just beginning to come out, but the favors for them came from Korea to the United States, but the United States sends money. We formed their CIA, and the United States CIA is made of taxpayers' money. So we pay our taxes in April, our income tax, or quarterly, and it goes into the CIA bank, and then they send it to the Korean CIA, and the Korean CIA sends it back to members of Congress, 30 or 40 Democrats, because certain Republicans they already have in their bags anyway that vote for the arms in South Korea and for the military repressions that are taking place there. So what we really have is our own tax money paying our own congressmen to continue spending expensive troops there and to justify the existence of their torture machine coming out of our tax money. And what you have here are congressmen who cannot be objective about what's going on in Houston, Texas, or Las Vegas, or Los Angeles, or Salt Lake City with the Hughes case, because they are unnamed, and this gentleman hasn't even named them. This A. Rosenberg has filed a suit merely for his $400,000, and his time in jail was paid for. But he says, without any doubt, these government officials, senators, and congressmen have and did invest, along with the mafia, in these hotels in Vegas. So it would be against their interest to pursue the Howard Hughes story, which is vital to this country, and I believe it's the #1 story in this country. I've said it before, because under the umbrella of the Hughes organization could come political assassinations, death squads, lists in Salt Lake City, data banks, and information was fed from the Los Angeles Police Department through the Hughes dynamics with the same Johnny Meyer, who has these documents now, into Salt Lake City data banks on what we're doing and how we're signing petitions, whoever's against abortions, if you're for marijuana being legal, everything that the LAPD and I presume police departments all over the country can be fed into these data banks. The Hughes story is a very big story, but here's one indication of why men in Congress won't open it up, why they won't even want to know if Hughes is alive or dead, because if he's dead, then their investment in Vegas would be shaky. And we already see this story here of how they put some of their own money into those investments, and in a way they're being blackmailed now about this story. I'm going to play a tape card that I took off of Good Morning America. I referred to it last week. It's about a 4-minute section, and I want you to hear it. It's Robert Hartman. It's in New York City, NBC, Good Morning America. And the gentleman talking is Brooks Randall, who was one of the doubles for Howard Hughes that I have written about in an article and talked about many times. And Brooks Randall goes on at the very end of the discussion to say that Howard Hughes is not buried in Houston, Texas, and he says the Attorney General in Houston, Texas doesn't believe it's Howard Hughes either. And then Jack Anderson, the great apologist for so much that's going on in this country of counterintelligence. He's a very selective person who exposes only part of the news. Rushes in very frantically, and the voice that you hear defending the fact that Clarence Kelly took the fingerprints off the body is Jack Anderson. I want to play that so you can hear Good Morning America in case you missed this last week.
He's here with us this morning, and so is Jack Anderson. Good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
When and where did you first meet Howard Hughes?
In 1948, at Jean Harlow Bellows, the mother of Jean Harlow, home in Palm Springs.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing a story on Jean Harlow, and the mother gave me the rights to it, and I would go there and spend weekends. And periodically, this man would drop in, and first she told me it was Frank Howard, and then later she told me that this was Howard Hughes, which I knew that it was.
And you became friends?
And we became friends. He would stay there sometimes overnight. I remember one time there's a restaurant there you might know in Palm Springs where a couple of elderly women run this restaurant and the home cooked food and all that, and they stand in line. And we went down there one time for breakfast, and here's this man with me standing, in line with other people to wait. He was a millionaire who's really not known by many people. They're seen. And I thought this at that time to be very strange. But
What was your impression?
I think he was a very sensitive man. He was a man who never used anybody or any detrimental thing, anybody that had done anything against him or anything that he thought, even people that he had to let go. He had two types of people that he let go. He never fired anybody. He would let those go that he didn't want to perform anymore for him, work anymore for him, but they would still be on salary to prevent them from saying anything about him at all. There was no conversation, just your check is sent to you and you keep your mouth shut, so to speak.
I've been looking for you for 2 years, as a matter of fact. And I got this picture here. This is a picture of Brooks Randall, and I swear it looks just like you. You got a little heavier, and he got a little thinner.
I weighed about 190 then.
You doubled him.
Yes.
When and
Why? Well, why did that?
Well, for a couple of years they tried to get me to do this. I was under contract, and he put me
think the
after
guy's outside.
meeting him in Palm Springs.
He's waiting for
Is
me.
that
2 years
Marvin or
later,
someone else?
Dick
No,
Powell,
I don't think Marvin's
one of the
here.
top
Vicky
men
gave
with
me the message.
Stephen Alexander, Archaeologist, that he was home at the time, called me in, and he says, the word from upstairs, you want
Excellent show,
you to be
mate.
put under contract
Okay.
personally to
That's
him
a
as
nice
writer
news about the
producer,
radio
It's
station.
a good station.
which was
What do you
fine.
think? It's
We
really
had a
good.
property
You're right
called
about those new
Deadfall.
guys. Nobody knows till we talk about
And I spent about 2 years trying to have Robert
Well,
Mitchum, who, unbeknownst to
This
me,
is a
wanted
good
to get out
station and
from
really
the
gave him a lot
contract
of
with Hughes and
freedom.
didn't want to
He
do
was
it.
really good.
And I was very anxious to
See,
do
courage
something.
pays
I
off.
really wrote-
People only
He
knew
wanted
they
you
had the
to
guts,
be his
you know?
double, and was
No, there was no idea of that at the time. There was a man previously to this, the late Ford, named Vance Cooper, who was an identical twin.
I
to you,
have a
was
cassette.
hired
Tell
for
him
that purpose.
So you have two of you.
to call
Right,
right to
right.
me or call me
What
home
did you
tomorrow
do?
morning. You have my number?
Well, he
Some
lived
people
as his
take it
double,
every week.
Vance
You
was
want to
double.
tell him?
In fact, there are people
No, 'cause this will be
who
off in a
worked
second.
supposedly for Hughes.
Tell him
Their
to
jobs
call
were
back
set
here
up. They would have a
at 10 after
secretary.
6.
Okay.
And the man she worked for, let's say, would assume that this was Howard Hughes. It was not Hughes at
Did you
all.
read this
And so Vance Cooper spoke
People
for
worked in the
Hughes.
office
Yeah.
and never
Did you
knew it
ever
was
speak
used.
for
As soon
Hughes?
as
No.
used, there was
You just
diagnosis.
appeared for him.
The people who would be known to be his,
They never
say,
knew it was
head
him.
bodyguards and the
People-
person in
it
charge
was
of
a double. They didn't know it was a double. They thought it was him.
California, Mike Conrad to me, Chenard to you, was in charge from 1950 of selecting all of his bodyguards. The majority of them were ex-FBI agents, football players, and so on and so forth. They would be known. We'd go to a place like Saxon Hotel in Miami, and the news would be out that Hughes is coming there.
I see. Well, we found you, Brooks. Where's Vance Cooper?
I think he's buried in Texas. That's how
It is.
Jack?
This is my opinion.
Well, I happen to be in on that because I'm concerned about the fact that there were doubles who were
Well, you'll
participating toward
find
you.
that the Attorney General in Texas believes exactly the same thing I do. That is not allegation.
I happen to be in on it.
It should be.
Because
It's only coming on one channel,
It
isn't it?
might be a double. I telephoned the moment I found out that Howard Hughes had appeared in Texas, and I telephoned the Secretary of the Treasury, Bill Simon, and told him of my suspicions and told him the reason for it. He called me back in 10 minutes. He says, we got agents on the way. And the first thing those agents did was to see that the corpse's fingerprints were taken. They called Clarence Kelly, the head of the FBI, and they
What a
got Clarence
liar.
Kelly personally to process those fingerprints. And the fingerprints of the corpse were the fingerprints of Howard Hughes.
Well, I feel otherwise, but I don't know. That may be possible. But my idea is I've had people that have been looking for Vance Cooper, the same thing. Bobby Hall, I talked to him about 6 months ago about this same possibility.
We found Brooks Randall. Now we got to find Vance
That's
Cooper.
what I was going to say, Mr.
If he's out there, I hope he's
Yeah,
not
try to call us, Mr. Cooper. Yeah. Brooks, thank you very much
Yeah, pleasure.
for being with us this morning.
Well, that's the story of Vance Cooper, who certain people believe is buried in Houston, Texas, and I think it's time to exhume that body. Hopefully, I wish they would. Incidentally, Hughes is buried in an unmarked grave, so it would be hard to locate in a cemetery where he is. On that tape, you heard him talk about Bobby Hall. Brooks Randall said he talked with Bobby Hall, and he didn't think Hughes was buried in Texas, and he did what he didn't say, and I mentioned, I think, last week on KLRB that Bobby Hall was murdered about a day or two after the two of them talked about Howard Hughes. And Bobby Hall was one of the gentlemen that helped supply the drugs and the dope for a person in Los Angeles, California, who was carefully medicated starting in 1946 until 1957, when he was never seen again and was zonked out on drugs, and only his voice was used for voice prints and his finger for fingerprints. There was another article about Hughes that shows the news blackout in this country from the Los Angeles Times, and this is December the 11th. And again, this isn't the Associated Press, the United Press, or Reuters, and it wasn't carried by any newspaper that I take in the New York Times or Washington Post, just like that article I read to you about the investment of the Mafia and congressman in the Vegas operation was not carried except by the Las Vegas Sun. And this article said, top Hughes aides refused to disclose who bought the medication for the billionaire. Now, this is an investigative work into John Holmes, one of the aides for Howard Hughes, who went to court last week and 2 weeks ago and took Fifth Amendment and would not incriminate himself by just saying who got the medication for Howard Hughes, which really is a very complicated thing if the man was sick and had a kidney disease. But he refuses to say, and the people that attended him will not say what druggist, what drugstore, where the medication came from. He had 4 chauffeurs and a psychologist that surrounded this body, and except for saying that he had aspirin and Valium, they are taking the Fifth Amendment. I don't think Valium was around when the one used started to be medicated. I think that's a fairly new medication. So the secrecy of the treatment of this man through this serious illness, where he has the brain tumor, the broken ribs, and emaciated down compared to a body at the German concentration camps, those attending him refused to say, for fear of injuring themselves, to even say what drugs were administered to this poor thing before the corpse was cashed in this last April. Well, time is up on Dialogue Conspiracy. This is, as I say, the last broadcast on Dialogue Conspiracy on Dolores Street. It's been a good 5.5 years, and I hope we'll have some more weeks before the station does change hands, and I hope the new owners will allow us to continue. And I feel sad about leaving this. This has been really a good place, and I hope we'll be on next week and for many, many years, and we'll just keep our fingers crossed. It's Mae Brussell and KLRB, Carmel, California.
Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell,
Perfect.
who for many
Delightful
years has
show.
been researching the facts
Delightful
behind
show.
political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB
Wait, you want your
FM
machine?
in Carmel, California.